The applause may be premature. Thank you very much, Lydia. Thank you for the kind invitation to deliver a guest lecture during this visit to IMU. It's always a pleasure to come here. I think this is an appropriate topic for presentation at IMU, given your own stellar performance and your meteoric rise in the educational rankings. And I have to say that this is an appropriate topic for such an ambitious, forward-looking university as IMU. I hope you'll find it interesting. It is a little bit esoteric, but I think it is more real, or will be more real in our daily lives than you might imagine. So hopefully at the end, you'll appreciate just how significant it is. I have no terrestrial or extraterrestrial conflicts of interest. Tan-Sri asked me just there, have I any involvement with Sir Richard Branson? No, Tan-Sri, I don't, but I'm open to offers. Okay. So I'd like to just take you on a whistle-stop tour of space tourism, focusing on some of the historical aspects, considering where space tourism currently is. We need to have some elementary knowledge of microgravity and its effect on human physiology, so I'll talk about that. We'll consider what it might be like to be a space tourist with pre-existing medical conditions. What is the role of the travel medicine practitioner in determining medical fitness to, well, not really fly, but to travel or exit Earth's orbit. And then we'll consider the future developments. But I might just draw your attention to the prophetic words of Professor Stephen Hawking. The font is small, so I'll read it out. He said, "I think the human race has no future if it doesn't go into space." I don't know if you agree with that. It's quite a profound statement, but Professor Hawking has been right about a lot of things, although some of the things he said we can't really prove. He may prove to be right in the future. More about Professor Hawking later. So my own interest in space tourism stems from an interest in high altitude medicine and in flight, although particularly avian flight. I had the pleasure of visiting the KL Bird Park for my 20th time yesterday, but every time it improves, and yesterday was the first time I got to hand feed an emu, so that was very special. And I got the video, Anam or Vishnu, if you want, I'll share it with you. It was quite an experience. So flight interests me, but of course I had a childhood obsession with this character. Do you all recognize E.T.? Okay, I won't give away my age, but this was the first movie I saw in the cinema. And I remember they were selling little figurines of E.T. and the heart lit up. This was quite advanced technology for the Jurassic period. And I couldn't afford to buy one. And so I remember after that, every time a new E.T. piece of memorabilia came out, somebody in the family would try to buy it for me. Quite a collection at the end, actually. And so that's E.T., and I guess that's where my interest in space came from. Since then, I've been realizing my spatial ambitions vicariously through my former students. This was actually a former student of mine. He's now a senior lecturer in medical technology in our university, and he's training to become a consultant endocrinologist. Not your ordinary student. He entered our university with a PhD in biomedical engineering, multiple patents under his belt. Quite an extraordinary student, really. At his interview, I remember saying to him that when I was teaching you, I wasn't sure who was the student and who was the teacher, but that's a very healthy state when you're teaching a student. So he's since gone on to great things, but he's a NASA flight surgeon in his spare time and has been training them with this neutral buoyancy simulation about how to cope with deep space habitation when people travel into deep space in the future. So his name is Dr. Derek O'Keefe, so look out for him, former student of ours. So to the students in the audience, I don't know if you've chosen your partner medical schools, but if you haven't and you come to NUI Galway, you might someday work for NASA as well. Galway is not known for its connection with the aeronautical industry, but watch this space. I had the pleasure of partnering with a colleague of mine in the Centre for Astronomy, and we wrote the first paper on the subject of space tourism for the travel medicine literature. It was quite an interesting exercise, and we concluded that travel medicine professionals should be familiar with space physiology and the demands of space flight so that they can advise civilian space passengers. That's really the purpose of it. So how many of you learned about space physiology in your undergraduate medical curriculum? Probably nobody. We certainly didn't, but I think in the future it may become part of the core curriculum. Now, it's not essential, but it's desirable if you're familiar with these characters. Hands up who watches The Big Bang Theory. Well, I'm very impressed. Tantri, you don't know what you're missing. Somebody has to introduce Tantri to the Big Bang Theory. So it's a wonderful sitcom. And just to summarize it, these are the two characters I've highlighted, Howard and Sheldon. Howard Wolowitz is a hapless MIT engineer. So he doesn't have a PhD now. So in this group, he's the only one without a PhD, apart from Penny, of course. There's Penny in the middle. Yeah. And Sheldon, the character Sheldon Lee Cooper, has 2 PhDs. And he always directs his acerbic comments at Howard. And he considers MIT no more than a trade school. And he doesn't take engineering seriously. But which of them got to go to space, to the International Space Station? Howard. So there's a major bone of contention, of course, with poor Sheldon. Interesting exchange here. Howard says, I'm an astronaut and you know it. You just don't like admitting it because you're jealous. Sheldon defends himself. Well, truth be told, as a child, I did dream of going to space. Those astronauts were my heroes. And when you got to go, it was hard for me. Thank you, says Howard, because it made me realize they'll just send anyone up there. So I wonder, will space tourism democratize space to such an extent that just about anybody can go up there and they'll open it up for the masses? Is that a good thing? We'll talk about that later. I would like to, attribute this slide to the late, great David Bowie. Again, hands up, who's listened to David Bowie's music? Very good. They're very in touch with the 80s music. David Bowie, of course, died last year. He obviously had a real interest in space. Several of his songs, Space Oddity, Starman, the Starman Waiting in the Skies, as he sang about, all related to space. And of course, he was a wonderful musician. But so far, most of the people who've gone to space have been star men. There's a real gender imbalance there. So we need to see more female astronauts and cosmonauts, I think. We've had nearly 540 space travelers to date, and they've come from 38 countries. Has Malaysia had an astronaut? Yes, you've had? Okay. So you're ahead of Ireland in that respect. So 3 of them only have completed a suborbital flight. Most of them have gone beyond Earth orbit. Low Earth orbit goes to about 1,600 miles beyond the Earth. And of course, some have traveled on the moon. 12 have walked on the moon. I'm not sure how many have done the moonwalk, but 12 at least have walked on the moon. Humans have spent nearly 80 years cumulatively in space. The person who spent the longest time in space was actually a physician cosmonaut who spent over 400 days on the Mir space station that no longer exists. We've had 7 space tourists to date. 1 went up twice, couldn't get enough of it. So we've had 8 trips by space tourists, which might surprise you as being very few actually. And there have been 18 astronaut or cosmonaut spaceflight fatalities. And if you do the mathematics on that, that works out at 3.35% of all trips to space have ended in a fatality. Do you think that's high? Certainly higher than taking a trip in an airplane. So that's the Starmen. Now, the first tourist to space was Dennis Tito. Now, Dennis wasn't an ordinary civilian. He was actually a former NASA engineer, a rocket scientist actually. And so he had some background in the subject. But he was the first to pay $20 million to travel to space as a space tourist. He spent 10 days in the International Space Station, about 400 kilometers above the Earth's surface. And then between 2002 and 2009, there were further 6 space tours who went to the space station. So they were orbital tourists, they weren't suborbital. Ansari had a prize called the X Prize, $10 million prize fund in 2004, and they put it up to companies to develop spaceflight technology that would enable people to go to the edge of the Earth's atmosphere and return safely, but twice. You needed to do it twice. And so a year later, I think, Spaceship One was launched, and that meant the successful trips. So that really beckoned in the era of space tourism. Virgin Galactic was founded. We all know its boss, Sir Richard Branson, in 2004. So now there's a healthy competition between SpaceX Adventures and Virgin Galactic. You can see they're not your ordinary spacecraft. There's a 3-part reusable spacecraft. You've got a rocket launcher, and then you've got a separation of the actual orbiter itself from that. So the rocket brings you to the edge of space, and then the orbiter takes you to suborbit. Because of setbacks along the way, including the Challenger disaster in 1986, Russia halted orbital space tourism in 2011. So now there haven't been space tours for a few years. And in 2017, just this year, SpaceX, which is led by Elon Musk, you all know Elon Musk of Tesla fame. Yeah, so Elon Musk has announced a prize fund for the lunar loop flight, which would be a flyby of the moon. And so that's the next challenge. Can we get space tours to fly around the moon, a circumlunar flight, or perhaps even eventually land on the moon, all those years after humans first landed on the moon. So these have been the various developments. But back in 1865, I think it was, Jules Verne wrote a wonderful book which had a lot of vision from the Earth to the moon, where really his description of the method of getting to the moon was incredibly accurate and prescient. You should read that book, really quite fascinating. And I'm sure the design of the spacecrafts will change over time. When we talk about space, we mean, well, since the 1950s, there is a standard definition that space is 100 kilometers above Earth, the so-called Kármán line, so 100 kilometers, about 60 miles. Beyond that is space. Commercial aircraft fly at about 10 kilometers cruising altitude. For a suborbital flight, you reach 100 kilometers, perhaps a little bit above it. But you don't travel at a speed sufficient to maintain a continuous orbit around the Earth, so it's suborbital in that respect. The orbital velocity is much higher than that. But you'll still be traveling about 4 times the speed that you'll be traveling on a commercial aircraft, about 2,500 miles per hour. But to get into orbit, it'll be much higher, at a much higher speed, 17,500 miles per hour. The International Space Station moves at 8 kilometers per second. So it's extraordinary. You're not aware of that motion, but that's how fast it moves. So that's orbital flight. Now, the Mir Space Station no longer exists. There aren't shuttles bringing tourists to the Mir Station anymore. But suborbital and orbital, there have been 7 orbital space tours, but no suborbital space tours. So they've just gone up to space and come back down again. And that's what we're in the stage of planning at the moment, and you'll hear more about that later. So it's likely that we might in the future, if we're lucky, and if the price of these trips comes down, might be able to take a suborbital flight. These flights are very expensive, 20 to 35 million US dollars, beyond the reach of most people. So these have been the space tourists so far. So there have been 7 of them, and they've been on 8 trips. Only one female again. This lady was an Iranian, Ansari herself. So, and she went up to the space station. This was the first man, Dennis Tito. He's a California-based investment manager who worked for NASA, as I said. But he was 61 when he first went to space. So, you know, age is not a barrier here. And Charles Simonyi, a Hungarian-American, went up twice. So again, I'm not sure they gave him a discount for the second trip. I think he had to pay the full amount. And this guy has obviously the greatest sense of humor of all of them. He's wearing his red nose. But Mark Shuttleworth is the youngest, 29-year-old South African. A lot of them are involved in the computer science industry. A lot of them are computer millionaires, or billionaires even. Maybe you can put your name up on that list in the future. But then they're quite particular about what they're called. You know, we call them space tourists, but they have their own opinions. Some like to be called private astronauts, independent researchers, because sometimes they're part of a research experiment as well. Private researcher, or Mark Shuttleworth has big ideas, pioneer of commercial space travel. But what's in a name? I like this quote from the CEO of Space Frontier Foundation. I hate the word tourist. Tourist is somebody in a flowered shirt with 3 cameras around his neck. So maybe we should be calling them, well, the US FAA calls them commercial astronauts, but NASA and the Russian Federal Space Agency refer to them as space flight participants. That's why we use that term in our paper. What's in a name? There have been some setbacks along the way. We mentioned the Challenger disaster, but also Virgin Galactic Spaceship 2 exploded over the Mojave Desert in 2014. It killed the co-pilot and badly injured the pilot. It was described by Branson, the boss of Virgin Galactic, as a loss. So again, this is a person who takes setbacks and moves forward always. And of course, Facebook lost a high-profile SpaceX rocket. They were trying to launch a satellite and that blew up, but that was unmanned. So there have been various setbacks along the way. And of course, these are expensive setbacks. All of these launches cost a lot of money. One wonders ethically whether we should be investing this amount of money, but this is nearly all commercially driven private industry now that's doing this. really NASA is bringing up all of its supplies to the space station now by using these commercial operators, such as the Falcon X rockets that Space Adventures produce. But the space industry is really starting to emerge. The UK has ambitious plans. James is in the audience. Ireland is even getting in on the act now. A travel agent in Ireland is offering the option of suborbital flights in the future. I'm not so sure I take that one seriously. But you can see it really probably will remain the domain of high net worth individuals, unless with economies of scale and more people start to travel to space, we'll see reduction in price. Maybe as little as $25,000. That figure has been used, and that might be attainable by people if they save up for it. And potentially 300,000 people a year could take a suborbital flight as the industry develops. Remember, so far, 0 people have had a suborbital flight as a tourist so far. Just the pilots who do those test runs, they're the only suborbital flights so far. I'm not so sure if the men will go to Mars and the women will go to the sunnier climate on Venus. We'll have to see whether that happens or not. But Space Adventures, that company, is the only company who's actually transported tourists to space so far. They're the company that took those 7 tourists to the space station in conjunction with the Russian Space Agency, because they used the Soyuz capsule that was launched from Baikonur in Kazakhstan. And they offer various experiences on their website, you'll see, but you'll see all these avatars. They don't really have real pictures yet. But you can have the opportunity to experience zero gravity, to see the Earth from 100 kilometers, and to float weightless for 4 to 6 minutes. And that would really be what it would be, just 4 to 6 minutes of weightlessness. Not zero gravity, really. We should talk about microgravity. It's not completely zero gravity. There is some gravity. So that's Space Adventures. And one survey predicted the growth of this industry, and you can see most of the growth will be in the suborbital market, and that's probably quite a conservative figure. Fewer people will take the orbital flights because they're longer periods in space, 10 days, 2 to 3 weeks. They're much more expensive, and the person requires G-tolerance training and needs to wear a spacesuit for launch and re-entry, and there's far greater risks, obviously, being in Earth orbit. But there's also industrial opportunities too. This is an artist's impression of a lunar mining operation. Eventually we will see commodification of space. Nobody really owns space on Earth. So there are opportunities for individual countries to mine asteroids or the moon and extract precious mineral ores as the resources on Earth become depleted. And most likely over time we'll find better ways of capturing the sun's energy in space rather than using inadequate solar panels on Earth. So I think there'll be a lot of activity. There is a danger, of course, too, that you will see wars fought in space. So I took a selfie, I have to admit, yesterday at the mall with the Star Wars thing in the background to promote the movie, and I sent it to some friends. So people are, obsessed with Star Wars, but I think you will see wars in space in the future. And this militarization of space could hamper efforts to provide safe space tourism. We'll have to see what happens. Hopefully that won't happen, and people will use space for the good of humanity. Wouldn't it be nice to be able to commute to academic council every year? I'm hoping when this happens that we can take a parabolic intercontinental flight from London to Kuala Lumpur, get here in about 60 minutes. With this, you would take a suborbital flight, you would leave your city on Earth and then travel to another city in remarkably short time. Paris to Los Angeles in 38 minutes. London to Melbourne in 90 minutes. Really extraordinary. Now, having suffered from jet lag last week without my melatonin, I wonder what would it be like to get from London to Melbourne in 90 minutes? I think it would be quite a stress. What do you think? Would you go over to London shopping for the day and come back if you could afford a flight like this? Well, this is a very real prospect. It has been talked about a lot, actually. The German Aerospace Center has developed this hypersonic space liner. And again, it's a 2-part affair. This reusable rocket will return to Earth. So the great thing that you can actually have a rocket that isn't expendable, that you can reuse it, recycle it. And then this part here, the capsule effectively, the orbiter, will have space for about 50 passengers. And then passengers will experience 4 to 6 minutes of weightlessness at the Kármán line, and then glide down to a runway. Really extraordinary technology. and well within current technological abilities. So in the future, this might be very real. Remember, Concorde no longer exists. There needs to be a quicker way to get around our planet, especially for the ultra-wealthy, and they will find this, I think, a very reasonable approach. So maybe in the future for us. These are the pioneers. We've mentioned Richard Branson already. There's Elon Musk. They're not rocket scientists, but they are pioneers and have great vision. Elon Musk is the CEO of Space Exploration Technologies, or SpaceX. So there's a healthy rivalry between the two in trying to bring space tourism to the masses. They obviously see great profit potential in it if they can refine the technology. And a lot of people have paid handsome deposits already to be taken to space as space tourists. I think at least 200 people have paid large amounts of money to go as suborbital tourists already. So these are the two players. There are already space ports around the world. This is a replica of the Kennedy Space Center that I have in my office. I haven't managed yet to launch anybody from it. You'll be glad to hear. But this is where the Russian Space Agency launch their rockets that bring cargo to the space station currently. And there's Cape Canaveral in Florida, Air Force Flight Test Center in Edwards Air Force Base, Mojave Desert, where Spaceship One was launched. And there are plans to develop new ones in Denver, Dubai, Sweden, the UK, maybe Malaysia is next. So I think you'll see a lot more space ports in the future. You'll also see terrestrial space flight entertainment. So people who will not go to space will at least be able to experience zero gravity or weightlessness and virtual reality and so on. So I think there'll be an industry on the ground as well, not just the industry in space. And there are even space tour operators and space travel agents emerging around the place. So virtual space travel is under development. Parabolic flights are currently available, where you can experience weightlessness. You pay about $25,000 for the experience. Edge of space flights are available. We've had no suborbital flights yet, 7 space tours, 8 orbital flights. And lunar flights, good progress is being made, and there have been ambitious plans to have lunar flybys by 2020. So we'll have to wait and see what happens there. No trip yet to Mars, but people have been talking about that. And by 2033, there are plans for a Martian orbit at least, with in the future hopefully habitation and colonization of Mars. You've all seen the movie, so you can see what's imaginable at least. These parabolic flights are extraordinary. So the aircraft speeds up and then slows down, pitches very steeply at 47 degrees, and then cruises for a few minutes or for a few seconds at that speed, and it causes the sensation of weightlessness, so people can actually float. And it's one way that astronauts are trained for the weightless experience. So parabolic flights, and these are available. If you want to sign up, you can. 20 seconds, I'm not sure that's enough. You can just go on a roller coaster and experience that effect briefly. For orbital space tourism, this will be a more complicated proposition, as I said. You have to learn how to endure G-tolerance acceleration vector stresses. You have to learn some Russian, enough to be able to communicate with the cosmonauts. And you have to have a very deep pocket, $35 million US. 4 to 5% risk of fatal accident during an orbital flight on average. So massive insurance premiums will be paid as well. And of course, you have to wear a pressure suit for launch and re-entry. And if there's any spacewalk involved, there wouldn't be for space tourists, although maybe in the future, where you do this extravehicular activity, where you go outside the spacecraft, you have to wear this 113 kilogram special extravehicular mobility unit, a very, very heavy suit. But of course, you're in a weightless environment in the vacuum of space. So a lot of things to do. And you spend 10 days to 3 weeks in currently the International Space Station, previously the Mir Space Station, and usually get to do some experiments as well. But you're much further above Earth, so you're well beyond low Earth orbit, traveling very, very fast indeed. Re-entry and landing currently using the Soyuz escape capsule, which lands hopefully somewhere in Kazakhstan, but it is designed to also be buoyant and land on water. Sometimes it has to be retrieved from water, and has enough oxygen in it to support 3 people for up to 15 hours. So when they're looking for it, they've up to 15 hours to locate them. It takes about 4 days to launch somebody to orbit, to the orbit of the space station, and to dock safely on the space station. It takes 4 hours for this Soyuz escape capsule to return to Earth. So really is an extraordinary technology. And you have to be able to breathe while experiencing significant G-forces, 4 to 8 G, which is 4 to 8 times 9.81 meters per second squared. So really significant. And you can imagine how difficult that must be. Also imagine if you're sick and have to be evacuated from the space station currently, it takes 4 hours to get down, but it takes about 2 days to prepare for that launch. You can't just hop in the car and go. It takes a while to prepare for it. And the victim, the patient, will be exposed to these significant G-forces on descent. So it's not an easy place to evacuate somebody from if they're very sick. These are all things we have to think about. There's even been prospects of a space hotel. So Robert Bigelow, the hotel magnate, has dreamed up this idea, and already there are ambitious plans in place. And these would be quite big hotels. They would have to generate artificial gravity, because it would be a long time to be exposed to microgravity. I think most hotel guests would not be able to put up with the physiologic stress, with the nausea, with the space motion sickness, and so on. And with the loss of muscle mass, they could go back to Earth, significantly osteopenic or osteoporotic. So it wouldn't be an easy trip. But in the future, I think we will see space hotels, and probably they'll be the domain of the super rich again. Different types of suborbital flights. So some involve a mothership that takes the space plane to a certain distance above the Earth, and then a rocket launches them from there, and then they have a few minutes of weightlessness where they can float around the cabin. This is the Spaceship Two that Virgin Galactic are working on, where the prototype suffered an accident in 2014, and then they glide back down to Earth, but not to the original runway. But this is not flown yet, but Lynx Aerospace is working on a model that's a one-piece ship that has a horizontal takeoff and horizontal landing onto a runway. But you have to be strapped into the seat in the front with the pilot. You don't get to float around. So there are different options for suborbital flights. But would you pay $250,000 to experience 4 minutes of weightlessness? That's what people are doing, including quite a few celebrities. They're calling them celebranauts. Celebranauts. Do you recognize any of these people? Well, which of these people do you think has paid his deposit to go to space in a suborbital flight? Who thinks it's Ashton Kutcher? Who thinks it's, what's his name? William Shatner. William Shatner, who was the captain on Star Trek. Well, you might be surprised, not William Shatner. William Shatner purports to be afraid of flying, ironically. But Ashton Kutcher is all set for it. This is quite interesting. This is really space by numbers. It's extraordinary to think of all the people who have paid the $250,000 for a few minutes of weightlessness. Stephen Hawking is another future celebranaut who's signed up for it. I think he'll get the flight for free. He deserves at least that. And others too. Some interesting facts about the space on the space station. The toilet is 4 inches in diameter. So people undergo special training using a positional trainer to ensure accuracy. Yeah. This is interesting. 18 million people viewed the YouTube rendition of Space Oddity, another David Bowie number given by Chris Hadfield. Chris Hadfield is a fantastic astronaut. Really has brought space to the masses. Very active on Twitter. While he was up in space, he was on Twitter all the time. And he made some very nice comments about Ireland from space. He said we looked particularly pleasant from space, which is nice. I hope he found it equally pleasant when he visited there. And so we really took him to our hearts. We felt a strong connection with him while he was in space. And he's written a fantastic book, and he's a lovely coffee table book of pictures from space. He was a very keen photographer as well. But he also played a song in space and had a huge, huge following. So that's the future. Deep space travel, we're certainly not there yet. There's a lot of research going on in NASA about how to support people, all the life support systems that would be needed, how to recycle all the different things you would need. You'd have to recycle 98% of the fluid that comes out of the body in order to provide enough water. I mean, there obviously isn't any source of water up there. So, and there's about a 44-minute communication delay, two-way delay in getting a message to Mars and back. So in terms of, you know, evacuating somebody, it's just not possible. There may be lunar or deep space medical facilities in the future, staffed by specially trained doctors and surgeons who can provide medical care in an emergency. But you're just too far away. People in Mars would be 360 million kilometers from Earth. You know, just to get there and back takes 520 days. That's if nothing goes wrong. If somebody has a ruptured appendix, you know, of course, 75% of the cases can be treated with IV antibiotics, but you know, if they need surgery, it won't happen. At the moment, crew flight surgeons, crew medical officers, unless they're a surgeon, is only basically trained in surgery. They can do basic suturing, but they'd have to be trained much better if they're going into deep space. So I think in the future, this is where you'll see a lot of doctors, nurses as well, I'm sure, who will train as aerospace physicians and surgeons. They'll be very useful in this kind of environment. You couldn't send astronauts up there without fully trained medics. Might even be scope for dual astronaut doctors as well. So it's really fascinating to think about it, and but it's not a very hospitable environment, obviously. Have you all seen the movie? Well, you know, if you're planning a sabbatical, you know, and you want something interesting, maybe a trip to Mars might be worthwhile. But choose your fellow passengers very carefully, because you're stuck with them for quite a while. And James, you might be interested in this. I think the Irish might be specially adapted for travel to deep space. You know, do you remember the movie with what was the actor's name? Yeah, what was his name again? The famous actor. Matt Damon, yeah, of course. So Matt Damon, so he was growing potatoes, do you remember? And he managed to figure it all out alone. But this International Potato Center, which I didn't know existed, no. They've been doing some research on this to see, you know, can you truly grow potatoes very well in that type of environment? So maybe it might be a place that the Irish will be drawn to. So spaceflight is very stressful. Here's Stephen Hawking, having been, you know, nearly 4 years in a wheelchair, experiencing 4 minutes of weightlessness at the Kennedy Space Center. Really an extraordinary spectacle, and it must have been a wonderful experience for him. But you've got more than just the microgravity to contend with. You've got low barometric pressure as well. In those extravehicular mobility units, they're already so heavy that they compromise weight by reducing the barometric pressure inside to 30% of sea level values. So they're breathing a very low oxygen mixture while having to perform some very challenging dexterous tasks with reduced muscle mass, with osteopenia, with probably space motion sickness. So these are very, very difficult and challenging things to do. There's also the risk of, you know, colliding with asteroids or space debris. They can usually predict if there's anything big in the area, but there have been collisions in the past with the space station. I'll show you an example in a moment. Then there's the ever-present risk of radiation, cosmic radiation, radiation from solar flares. We're so well protected on Earth, yet we're not fully protected from radiation. But if you're an astronaut, especially making repeated trips, you have a much greater risk of cancer and genetic mutations. The acceptable lifetime risk of cancer in an astronaut currently, according to NASA, is 3%, which is much higher than it would be for other jobs. But that's certainly something to consider. Probably won't be a factor for suborbital tourists, but for orbital tourists it might be a factor. Then there's the noise and the vibration. It's not a very pleasant place, in the space station. Temperature fluctuations and the risk of cabin air contaminants, because the cabin air is very carefully controlled, but there is always the risk that it can become contaminated by various chemicals, and it's not easy then to vent those. So there is the risk, there's a whole load of chemicals that are a threat to the astronaut, not just carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide. So you can see that it's a very dangerous environment. The G tolerance training, I mean, the body's exposed to significant G forces, about 5G during launch, 4 to 8G during descent, but sometimes if there are steep trajectories needed, it could be as much as 20G. People who are susceptible to G forces can suffer syncope with as little as 4G. So, you've seen people on roller coasters who faint. And this is well known in aerospace medicine, where in the training stage where people pass out, or even those fighter jets, sometimes during some maneuvers with significant G-forces, the pilot can have a syncopal episode, which can obviously be devastating. Richard Branson has done his G-tolerance training. He wants to be one of the first suborbital tourists. And Tim Peake was very well publicized in the UK and Ireland. He wasn't the first British astronaut, but very high profile. He was performing somersaults for the camera, and he was really, again, like Chris Hadfield, bringing space to everybody on Earth. And everybody was watching live part of his descent to Earth, where he experienced 5.5 G of acceleration forces. But he made it back safely and wants to go back again, which is the extraordinary thing. So the microgravity, the day-to-day experience on the spacecraft would be very challenging. Droplets, of course, don't fall to the Earth, so they float. So even sneezing or coughing has its challenges. Even performing surgery in that kind of environment, it hasn't happened. There's never been surgery needed so far in the space station. The risk of acute appendicitis is once every 35 years, I believe, actuarially. So even during surgery, it would be very difficult because the air in the surgical space would have about 10 times the number of particles than it would on Earth, because normally they'd settle down on Earth on the floor and various other surfaces, but here they'd be airborne. So it's challenging. Blood also, of course, would be airborne as well, making it much easier to identify areas of bleeding requiring hemostasis. But then suturing the abdomen closed would be challenging because the bowel loops would float to the... So there's all sorts of challenges in doing this. And even just suturing somebody, you can't stand down. You'd have to be tethered. You'd have to be tethered to the wall. Just to sleep, your sleeping bag is tethered to the wall. You can't just float around during sleep. Remember, your bones are brittle. You lose about 1% of bone mineral density every month on the space station. So you're doing exercises all the time as a countermeasure to ensure that your bone mineral density improves. Eating is a problem too. You can't just leave your fork and knife on the plate. Again, everything has to be, it's all magnetic, so it'll stick to that, and everything has to not float away. And when you're drinking, if you're drinking through a straw, you have to drink through a straw. You don't want the droplets floating around the place, because the droplets will get into the water system. They'll get into the condensate, and then that will get into the air supply and the water system and contaminate it. You can't use wipes. Those hand sanitizer gel, you have it all around the place here. Can't use that because, again, the alcohol will contaminate the condensate and get into the water supply. So there's so many practical things that you have to consider. Urinating, defecating, significant challenges. The biggest threat, of course, is embolism, but that would be a risk if there was some breach of the perimeter of the space station. That hasn't happened yet. Or if during a spacewalk there was some loss of pressure. Embolism is the worst imaginable fate, where in the vacuum of space, because the low pressure, the body's fluids would effectively boil at body temperature. So effectively the blood and everything would literally boil. So it's not compatible with life. Humans are really not adapted for life in space, as you can see. So all sorts of difficulties, even taking photographs. This man is sleeping in space. Taking photographs in space is a challenge because the space station traveling at 8 kilometers a second, you need very fast shutter speeds. So it's not easy to get good photographs. The astronauts were asked about their sleep in space, and they say that they dream actually just like on Earth, very, very well. Must be disconcerting, though, waking up that first morning, when you wake up in an unfamiliar bed and realize that you're 400 kilometers above the Earth. Must be fascinating. And of course, they can't just have a shower in space. You're depending on wipes. You can use germicidal wipes. So just think of all the droplets floating around. And they have to be protected from radiation, so it has panels protecting it, but there are windows as well, and they don't protect you 100% from the radiation. You certainly have to wear sunscreen, high-factor sunscreen, and can't look out the window too much, and you have to take vitamin D supplements. They usually come down from space quite pale. And if that wasn't enough, well, you could have problems with the detonation of the vehicle on the launch pad, as we've seen before. Fire. And a fire in the space station would be catastrophic, unless it's a minor thing that they can put out quickly. That's a very difficult thing to deal with. So they're very stringent fire safety measures. Colliding with an asteroid or a meteorite, or conflict, interpersonal conflict, and so that's a real challenge, you know. So you have to be very well selected and trained in order to put up with people for that length of time. And if you are doing an extravehicular activity, wearing the extravehicular mobility unit or spacewalk, unlike George Clooney, please just hold on, don't let go, or you'll end up floating away. In terms of the cardiovascular effects, you can see there's a number of different effects. The heart rate increases, particularly during those spacewalks, but during launch and re-entry. Stroke volume, cardiac output increase. But there is less tolerance of orthostatic stress when you return to Earth. There is, because you don't have the hydrostatic forces at play in this type of environment, you get a distribution towards the head, or a cephalad distribution of about 2 liters of fluid, causing a dilutional anemia. And so effectively the person feels that their head is very full, the plethoric feeling that patients get, nasal congestion, nosebleeds potentially, chemosis, mucosal injection. So the head is very, very full, and the legs have relatively less blood. So-called chicken legs that they're described, because you also lose muscle mass as well. So significant effects. In terms of arrhythmias, atrial ectopics, ventricular extrasystoles, there have been few cases of ventricular tachycardia, brief runs of it at space, but not much. And you might wonder as well about what to do if somebody's heart stops in the space station. Well, it is equipped with an AED and with telemetry, but it's not possible to do conventional CPR. Again, you won't have that option to just go on the floor and do CPR. So they've worked on this, and NASA has come up with clever ways to do this, where the person administering the CPR hasn't been needed yet, mind you, assumes the head down handstand position and pushes themselves with their legs off the roof, off the ceiling, and then does chest compressions that way. But the person, then the victim, has to be tethered onto one surface. So really challenging just doing CPR to generate enough force for chest compressions. But remember, you can't do it indefinitely. And in terms of exiting from there, well, in the space capsule, the escape capsule, you have to be sitting upright. So you can't lie down in the space capsule. So really, unless the person was defibrillated, it would not be an option of evacuating them. And then you would be dealing with a corpse in the space station. It hasn't happened yet. 3 people have lost their lives during re-entry when their Soyuz escape capsule depressurized, but nobody has actually died on the space station yet. This is a very pleasant conversation for a Monday afternoon. Not really. The musculoskeletal effects, I think, are well known to you. The bone mass significantly reduces, so they're at greater risk of low impact osteoporotic fractures. The spinal column, the vertebral column, lengthens by up to 7 centimeters. Up to 7 centimeters. But most people get taller on the space station, get taller in space. And that can cause back problems. So a lot of astronauts report lower back pain, but 75% of them report lower back pain. So they've lost muscle mass, they have muscle atrophy, it gets replaced with fat, the bones get weaker, and the legs get thinner in volume as well because of the redistribution of fluid. And they're greater risk of urinary calculi as well, so ureteric calculi or kidney stones, because of the negative calcium balance, because of calcium being taken from the bones. And when they do return back from space, you can see they're not in very good condition, and they're usually quite dizzy for some time after this. It takes days to weeks to recover, but they're quite dizzy. They have orthostatic imbalance and difficulty, just really like motion sickness in a way, difficulty looking into the distance. And some people are prone to space motion sickness. This was first described in the 4th manned space flight. And since then it's been studied greater, and it's something that comes on quite quickly. People suffer projectile vomiting, no premonition, and it now is thought to affect up to 50% of astronauts during the first 24 to 72 hours. And then after that it goes away and doesn't tend to recur. And the units for this space motion sickness, the way of describing the nausea, are called garns, after Senator Jake Garn of the US, who, when he was an astronaut, suffered extreme space motion sickness. So they named the units after him. So you suffer from so many garns if you have space motion sickness. But this actually can be a dangerous phenomenon if somebody were to vomit while wearing the space suit. If it happens elsewhere, then they'll have to capture the vomit. There are all sorts of difficulties with it. They have vomit bags everywhere, like you would on an airplane, so that you're never very far from a sick bag. But it can be a bit of a problem. Some people are more prone to it than others. And this is another difficulty, space intracranial hypertension, or visual impairment intracranial pressure, or VIIP syndrome. And this is where there is increased pressure in the skull. Some people are prone to it. It can cause permanent visual loss. So again, the medical clearance of astronauts is very, very detailed, to remove people from consideration who are prone to these conditions. But sometimes you can't fully select them in advance. NASA have been coming up with very clever ways of monitoring intracranial pressure non-invasively, using transcranial Doppler and even an instrument that detects the pressure in the optic nerve. So again, the space industry has spurned a lot of very useful technologies that we use on Earth in our day-to-day medical lives. Infection control is a real issue, and some people think that this will be a limiting factor to our ability to permanently inhabit space, because there is immune suppression in space. There is altered cytokine production, reduced leukocyte proliferation, defective natural killer cell activity, and so all of these effects combine to make it more likely that somebody will develop infections, including reactivation because of defective cellular immunity of latent viruses. So part of spaceflight preparation involves quarantine for a week before the person travels to space. These are astronauts on Apollo 11 mission talking to their partners, but they're in quarantine. The Apollo 7 and I think the Apollo 11 missions, all of the astronauts, despite the quarantine, developed upper respiratory tract infections. Bacteria as well in space are much more likely to grow. There's a reduced lag phase, so you get increased bacterial virulence in space as well. Big problem. You can't use the hand sanitizer gels, as we said. So you need to vaccinate these astronauts against various things. You need to screen them against latent infections like tuberculosis, schistosomiasis, strongyloidiasis, if they're from countries that are endemic or if they've traveled to countries where they may have picked up these infections. Histoplasmosis, you have to vaccinate them against varicella zoster. I think you'll see a lot more vaccines in the future specifically aimed at astronauts. Whether it'll be a problem for the suborbital tourists, probably not, because they're not long enough in space. But certainly for those who are going to be going to orbit or going to be going to the space station or deep space, it will be a real issue. So infection in space, very important. And of course, there is also then the psychological effect of traveling to space, the confinement, close quarters with other people. As the cosmonaut Valerie Ruman said, all the necessary conditions to perpetrate a murder are met by locking two men in a cabin of 18 by 20 feet for 2 months. Sometimes they stay up there for 6 months. Tim Peake was up in the space station for 6 months. Would you have the ability to get on with your fellow human for 6 months in a confined quarter like that? You have to be a really special person. Astronauts are very carefully screened for instability, impulsivity, difficulties getting on with other people. I think you have to be very, very flexible. This third quarter phenomenon is interesting. I think I've observed this at altitude, although it isn't described in altitude. But after the first half of the trip is over, then you see all of these psychological issues emerging. I certainly used to see it at altitude. After the summit had been reached, that first bit after that, I used to find a lot of anxiety in the group, and sometimes people were depressed. They would come to the surface as well. And that's been described in space too. After the first half, the excitement maybe of the first half sustains people, and then after that, they can't wait to get back and they get anxious. There is, of course, the fear of sudden death and the isolation and so on. But nowadays, of course, there's very good communication with the ground. And people get tired as well. Some people are just very lethargic in space. And then it takes them a while to adjust to civilian life afterwards. Now, this is a warning to people that You should not play chess in space. NASA recommend against it because it causes too much conflict. So you can imagine the Russian cosmonauts and the American astronauts can be very competitive, and you wouldn't want to lose. So they actually recommend that you don't play chess in space. And I found this very interesting. This is advice in this very good textbook written by the president of Space Adventures, the Space Tourist Handbook. Really very clever book. And chapter 4 deals with how to appear sane in the psychological exam. So for the students in the audience, if you're doing an interview in the future, this is good advice for any interview situation. Do not smile constantly. Difficult for you because you smile a lot, and that's a wonderful trait. But in an interview, be careful. Do not twitch. Avoid looking to the left when answering questions. We all know that. Can suggest you're not being honest. Do not make snap judgments. Avoid use of the royal we. So you need to be independent and stand on your own 2 feet. So I, not we. Avoid uncontrollable sobbing. Yeah, that would probably exclude you, I think, if you did that. So that's good advice. In terms of medical emergencies, you might be interested to know there have only been 3 medical evacuations. You can't do them quickly. There have been illnesses over the years, mostly mild illnesses. Since the quarantine was introduced, mostly minor infections, maybe cold sores, boils, carbuncles, that kind of thing. A number of people on the Apollo 13 mission developed urinary tract infections. 3 astronauts developed UTIs. And they were treated with tetracycline, but it was ineffective. So eventually the urine grew Pseudomonas aeruginosa. In space, there is a growth of aerobic bacteria in the colonic flora and a reduction in anaerobic bacteria. So Staph aureus, Pseudomonas, some of these organisms are much more likely. And we're not really sure yet what dose of drugs you can give in space. Maybe the pharmacodynamics, pharmacokinetics of drugs are affected by weightlessness. There's possibly the whole medical encyclopedia will have to be rewritten for the conditions of space travel. Is it safe to go there if you have a hip prosthesis or a pacemaker, or if you've had a PTCA angioplasty, if you've had an aneurysm clipped, and if you have an aneurysm, is it safe? So still a lot to be learned. Maybe the future students will be researching this. It's really great scope for original research here. But people have had to evacuate because of intractable headaches, where there was a fear of an aneurysm or meningitis. You can use ultrasound in the space station, but you can't use X-rays. There's too much interference. So they need to find some other imaging modality that it doesn't weigh a ton that you can put up in the space station, where everything has to be very carefully weighed. Prostatitis-induced sepsis, again, wasn't picked up with the screening, and one cardiac arrhythmia, but it wasn't fatal. The kidney stones, they called off that evacuation because, again, kidney stones, you often pass them. So fortunately, that person didn't have to be evacuated. But this is a very interesting article I commend it to, Emergency Medicine in Space. The authors, of course, are biased because they're all emergency physicians, but they do predict that in the future, it'll be emergency physicians who will have the greatest role in space. Now, I would say perhaps GPs as well, family doctors, will be very useful in that kind of environment because a lot of the illnesses will be day-to-day illnesses that you'd meet in general practice. But it'd be handy to have a surgeon, emergency physician, maybe a cardiologist, and a GP, maybe a psychiatrist as well. And so there are guidelines written for astronauts and more recently for space flight participants in general. If you look through the list, it's 5 pages of contraindications to space travel. You think there's no way you would qualify. But just to share this with you, first of all, this is Mike Massimino. Now, he's a real astronaut, really, from a very unlikely background, but he's an engineer, did a PhD, but grew up in a very poor part of the Bronx in New York, and really remarkable life story, and became a NASA astronaut. Really fantastic individual, great attitude to life. And he acted as a cameo on an episode of The Big Bang Theory, and a few episodes. He actually was in space when Howard Wolowitz went to the space station. Do you remember that? He's actually a real astronaut, and he had a cameo role. And I love this exchange between Howard and his mother. We never get to see her, Mrs. Wolowitz, or between Mike and Howard. Mike says, "You know how astronauts need to have the right stuff? You remember the movie? Sure, the stuff you have is wrong." So I think you need to have the right stuff physiologically if you want to be a space tourist. But the very first space tourist had a very interesting medical profile. Remember, he was 61 at the time, bullous emphysema, so COPD, spontaneous pneumothorax requiring a talc pleurodesis, and a mass in the lung that hadn't been investigated. And he paid $20 million to spend 10 days in the space station. So they evaluated and they did thoracoscopic pleurodesis to ensure he wouldn't have any more pneumothoraces. They biopsied the mass. Luckily, it was benign. And he got to finish his 10 days without any problems. So perhaps it is easier to survive in space for 10 days. And a lot of us then will be included. And his history was written up by authors in Aviation, Space, Environmental Medicine in 2006. It's all in the public domain. Very interesting, I thought. What about the ethical and legal challenges as well? Nobody owns space, but is it right to be investing so much in this? Is it the domain just of the super rich? Is it ethical to be going to space? Also, environmentally, what effect are we having on space? With rocket engines spewing hydrocarbons into the stratosphere, will we see alteration in the distribution of ozone? Will we see changes in the atmosphere? Will it accelerate climate change, as has been predicted? And I mentioned earlier about all the debris that's up there. There's a lot of space junk in space at the moment. And in fact, there's much less space than there used to be. This was some debris that actually chipped the window of the space station. And again, if it had breached it, it would have been catastrophic. So not a safe place in many respects. Now, I wrote an article some time ago on the selfie phenomenon. And it was inspired by my experience of traveling and almost colliding with people holding selfie sticks and so on. And I can see selfies are still popular here in Malaysia as they are in Ireland. But will we tire with people coming back, sending their space selfies? Will we have to watch endless slides of space photographs, including the ones that didn't work out? Will we develop a tolerance to this as well? Is it adventure? Is it narcissism? And then what will travel medicine's role be in all this? Will we be determining fitness to travel? Will we be vaccinating civilian space passengers? And will we have to have a good knowledge of space physiology? Where will we get that? Will it be in our postgraduate training or undergraduate training? There is a master's in space medicine you can do somewhere, I think in the United States. But is it something where you'll see lots of space medicine masters developing? Will IMU develop one eventually? We're working on a MOOC together. We'll have to mention space tourism as part of that because that's the future of travel. And will some of you become dual astronaut physicians? And like Mrs. Wolowitz, Howard's mother says, I don't want to go near the computer, I'll catch a computer virus. Howard says, you can't catch a computer virus. She says, oh, so now you're an astronaut and a doctor. I think you'll have to be an astronaut and a doctor. So doctors will be very useful to NASA in the future. Or will we see virtual reality applied to astrotourism, where you can use the Oculus Rift virtual reality goggles and experience space from the ground? Will people not travel much in the future because the virtual reality is just as good, cheaper? And when I was going through your IT office the other day, I saw some virtual reality goggles there. So you're already using them, hopefully. So in terms of risk, Elon Musk was asked about this, and he recognizes that the space tourist who signed up for suborbital flight knows the risks. They're going into it with their eyes open. But bear in mind, there are significant terrestrial gravitational risks as well. So here's Richard Branson, who wants to go on a suborbital flight, and he fell off his bike in the Caribbean. And his quote was, his life flashed before his eyes. So he nearly died, falling off a bike. That's the dangers of gravity. And here's Buzz Aldrin, who was the second man to step foot on the moon in 1969. And he had to be evacuated from an expedition. Mind you, he was 86 at the time, so he did very well to be there. And so again, Earth has its risks as well. Perhaps we're safer in space with all the nuclear threats and threats of viral annihilation and climate change. Maybe evacuate the people think, depends on your perspective, that elementally we come from the stars. Is it appropriate that we should now go out there again to space and escape Earth? It's sad a little bit, I think, but who knows what the future will hold. There's a lot of developments now, and Google have offered a prize, $20 million this time, to develop the technology to bring tourists around the moon, a lunar flyby. Not to land them on the moon yet, but $20 million just to get them around the moon, a circumlunar flight. And they're expecting that to happen soon, actually. So I'll leave you with the wise words of the original pioneer of flight. Wilbur Wright, who said, "It's not really necessary to look too far in the future. We see enough already to know that it will be magnificent. Only let us hurry and open the road." So I think we are in the era of commercial space flight, and doctors and other healthcare providers will have a very real role in assessing and in supporting astro tourists. So as we said before, watch this space. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take any question. James?
Can I tell my own experience? When I was a PhD student with Mark Langer, who you mentioned there,
Yeah.
I was doing remote sensing and space science and I was playing rugby. I was super fit, and the European Space Agency advertised for an Irish astronaut when I applied.
Oh, because you have a background in physics.
So like 100 levels of interview.
Wow.
But I got past the first medical and I got past the kind of technical. I thought,
Really?
oh, great.
Well done.
But I failed on a very simple premise. I'm a deuteranope. I'm colorblind. You cannot be colorblind.
You can't be colorblind, no.
All of the panel coding
Yeah.
and all of the information is
Yeah.
color coded.
That's right.
So even though I the other
Wow.
I covered the hard parts, the fact that I couldn't tell the difference between
That's extraordinary.
red and green totally precluded me. However, if you have a, I'd like you to comment on this. If you have a high level of ocular accommodation, like you wear glasses, it doesn't preclude you because I think
Yeah.
your eyes change shape and space.
That's right, they do. And in fact, Mike Massimino, the astronaut I show there, he was myopic. And so initially he was excluded. But then the regulations changed and he benefited from that. So he kept applying. Like you, that was the only thing that was barring him from becoming an astronaut. So when they relaxed the guidelines in that regard, once they understood better the changes in the corneal curvature in space, he was allowed to become an astronaut.
I think people who have healthy vision on Earth can sometimes become myopic in space.
Indeed. And indeed, at altitude, this can happen as well. People become more myopic at altitude. But this is a different type of effect. I think it's not due to hypoxia, because the oxygen level is controlled in the space station. It's due to other factors. So you were nearly there, James. You never know if the rules change. You know, you might just complete another application form.
Hopefully there's no police here. I'm not supposed to drive in Malaysia.
Oh, with the colour blindness. I think red-green colour blindness also is a contraindication to becoming a pilot, as far as I know.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. But I think even for people driving, it must be a bit of a hindrance.
You can get corrective lenses.
Yeah, can.
That chop out bits of light you have access to.
Yeah.
If you're driving with me and I ask you what colour is the traffic light, just answer the question. We'll say,
Okay. We didn't hear that last comment, James.
People always say why.
Well, I think you're all very competent drivers here, because the traffic in KL, with all the lane shifting, I mean, it really does bring out the best in a driver. I don't think I could drive in Malaysia. I think you need to be very skillful. Any more questions? Yes, please.
So I'm about to ask Gerald whether if you know anybody has been refused into space because of poor dental health.
Oh,
whether
yeah.
there have been reports of, complications of the oral craniofacial sort of.
Oh, yes. Well, again, if I'd known there was going to be a dentist in the audience, I would. As part of those commercial or standards for spaceflight participants, all the medical standards, there's a whole section devoted to the skull and to the teeth and to the sinuses. The difficulty here would be if there was dental caries sufficient to increase the risk for a dental abscess, or recurrent chronic sinusitis. So people who have chronic rhinosinusitis are excluded. So there are definitely exclusions around dental caries. As to what extent, I don't know, but the astronauts do have to be assessed by a dental surgeon in advance. They have to be assessed by a whole number of different specialists. But to what extent dental caries would exclude them, I'm not sure. There's also, of course, the risk of infective endocarditis as well. So they're very carefully assessed. So there are exclusions, and I can certainly tell you what they are tomorrow, because they're in that manual. The manual has so many exclusions, it's incredible. So there probably will be dentists involved as well in space too, because people are not very good at repairing their own loose fillings in a wilderness environment. So I think in space might be quite difficult. You may have to have a whole multidisciplinary team. Do any of the students want to go to space after this? Well, I think hopefully in the future we'll see more space physiology in undergraduate curricula so that people at least have a basic knowledge of it by the time they graduate. And maybe in the future IMU will lead the way in this. But do keep an eye on developments here because it's happening very, very quickly. And already one of my former students working with NASA. So we'll see what happens. Okay, I've taken up enough of your time. Thank you very much indeed.